Hello and welcome to this keynote address with Kathleen Fitzpatrick. I am so glad to welcome you. I'm really enjoying seeing where everybody's from in the chat. It's super exciting. My name's Robin DeRosa, and I'm the director of the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative at Plymouth State University. We are a regional public rural university in central New Hampshire, where there's still a little snow on the ground outside my house. And this keynote is being brought to you as part of, it's actually really the grand finale of our cluster pedagogy learning community, which I won't get too much into cluster pedagogy, although our cluster initiative, I think, does owe some debts of gratitude to the kinds of ideas that Kathleen works on. Particularly in this learning community, we focused on interdisciplinarity, project-based learning, and open education. And we had, I don't know the total number actually, but over 100 faculty and staff participating through the Davis Educational Fund grant that we got. Special shout out to Hannah Hansel, Martha Burtis, and of course, our conspirator, Kathy LeBlanc, who helped us with the CPLC. And that learning community has been reading, studying, talking, discussing, attending events. And one of the books that we actually kicked off with years ago when we first started was Generous Thinking. So we're really happy to kind of bookend our CPLC by having Kathleen here. Generous Thinking is a paradigm shifting book. There's much in its pages about practice, about how we actually do the work of teaching and learning inside colleges and universities, but it embeds those practical ideas in a larger framework that offers a radically different lens through which we can view the missions of our institutions. Part of what I love about Generous Thinking is the way that it asks faculty in particular to call in our publics, to make our work accessible and relevant, not only to our students, but also to communities outside of higher ed who can benefit from our teaching and our research. To that end, as I think about introducing Kathleen Fitzpatrick today, I think about how to use language that calls in a broader community, that opens up her work beyond her current readers and our current allies in the struggle to rethink higher education as a driver of the public good. A word that seems especially important to the critique of what's wrong in higher ed today, and also especially unfamiliar to those outside the academy, is the word neoliberalism. Yes, I'm going to go there. It's a complicated sounding term for a complicated idea, but I might quickly offer a definition that I think might help more of us come to see what's so radical about Kathleen's ideas. So to overly simplify a little bit, neoliberalism is a collection of ideas that bind together to create policies and models for organizing society, including education. And at their core, these ideas suggest that free markets will generally deliver our best future. And that if we support private profit, if we elevate the agency of the individual, and if we cater to new and emerging markets, the public will ultimately be enriched and society will progress. Sometimes you hear people, folks like me, and by that I mean actually me, using neoliberalism as a dirty word, because folks like me, and by that I mean I think, there are things, good things that exist outside of the economic market. But of course, here in the United States and in most of the world where you're tuning in from, there is very little that exists completely outside of economic markets. If you, like me, work at a public university, you may spend a lot of time, like me, wondering how your college is supposed to survive in a private market that's pretty difficult for public higher ed right now. And if you are, as I originally was, a literature professor, or like my husband, a sculpture professor, perhaps you wonder even more about the logic of markets governing what feels like every decision that gets made inside of our college. I came to Kathleen's book sure that there was a more human logic, a more open logic, a more generous logic. And I really feel like Generous Thinking gives us that paradigm shift that allows us to reconsider the boots on the ground work that we do every day as faculty, as staff, in partnership with our students. Kathleen is a teacher, a professor, a researcher, and a humanist. And I'm so really grateful that she is spending her time, her generosity does not go unnoticed, and that she's also been generous enough to open this keynote so that we could really invite anybody in for access. So thank you for being here, Kathleen. We will have time for questions at the end. We're going to use the Q&A for questions. Don't feel like you have to wait until then. If you want to start dropping them in as they occur to you, that's fine. You can also use the chat to talk to each other. I am going to say right off the bat that we will not be saving or downloading or making available the chat afterwards. So whatever you want to do there is fine. Martha and Hannah and I will try to monitor it and keep track of questions there, but the Q&A is your best bet for asking Kathleen a question when she's finished. So with that, Kathleen Fitzpatrick.
Robin, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who have decided to join us here on a Friday afternoon, where we are at least, a Saturday morning in Australia, and who are here listening and wanting to think some about these questions. Robin, that was a really extraordinary introduction and a really generous description of the book and what it's done. I want to note that Robin and I first started talking about this keynote before the pandemic, right? It was not long after Generous Thinking had come out. And things got delayed, as everything did. But here we are finally getting to have this conversation together. If you're right, that is a thing indeed. If a little bit delayed and at a kind of distance. But I'm delighted to get the opportunity to do this. Given the time that's elapsed in between, what I'm going to be speaking from today is a talk that really starts from generous thinking and then thinks about the last 2 years and what we should learn about where we are and where we're headed. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and make sure that that is working, I am hoping. And excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm going to get started. Again, I remain sorry that I didn't get to come to New Hampshire to talk with all of you today. But, we get to do a lot of things differently now, for better and for worse, right? Like we've learned that we can do a lot of things via Zoom that we thought we had to travel for. And that in the process of doing that, we can invite a whole lot more people into the conversation. And there've been a lot of lessons like that over the last 2 years. Some of them have been positive, many of them have been much less so. But I'm hoping that these are lessons that we can carry with us as we continue the process of returning to campus and returning to the ways that we have done things in the past. And I want us to carry these things with us, not least because I am increasingly convinced that returning to normal, whatever that was, or seeking to create a new normal would be a really costly mistake. We have an opportunity, I think, to avoid normal and to build something better instead, something that's more fluid and capable of growth. But coming back better is really going to require us to think pretty differently about the structures within which we work and about how to change them to support the kinds of institutions that we genuinely want to be part of. So that's my focus for today. Before I move on, a quick little warning that there is a bit of language coming up on the next slide in case you've got little ones around and want to shoo them away or anything of the sort. Anyway, I will now move on. So last year, oh gosh, time flies. 2 years ago, just before everything began shutting down, sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom posted a thread on Twitter in which she talked about the things that she tells early career Black scholars who seek her advice on surviving in the attention. This place was fucked up when you got here. It will be fucked up when you leave here. All you can control is how much you let it fuck you up in the process, right? And that is a pretty impolitic stance, she said, but I stand by it. I don't think these institutions can support us or love us, and I honor the many, many people who work to make them humane, but you alone cannot do that, and you cannot do it ever by killing yourself. Now, we've seen all kinds of evidence over the last 2 years of the horrifying accuracy of this perspective, right? That no matter how much we might love and support them, our institutions cannot and will not love us in return. These institutions have long been dedicated first and foremost to their own survival. And we've seen that priority play out in a wide range of decisions that privilege the security of the institution over the well-being of the people that it comprises. So I include in this category the choice to prioritize the flow of tuition dollars over the safety of students and staff by returning too hastily to in-person instruction, the choice to prioritize institutional reputation over individual safety and dignity by suppressing, ignoring, and dismissing complaints of sexual harassment and assault, the choice to respond to calls for racial justice with superficial statements and underfunded add-on measures, and the choice to deploy an increasingly militarized police presence in response to civil protest. All of these choices share the conviction that the institution and its ways of being are far more important than the people for whom it exists. And all of them have led me to ask, what would be required for us to remake the university as an institution?
You have indeed frozen, Kathleen. Oh, actually, I see that you're muted.
What happened is I dropped from the call altogether and then came back in. So
you know why? The neoliberal university is trying to silence your voice, Kathleen. Fight
apparently
back.
Okay, so I'm going to turn off my video and hope that that helps with the internet instability. Zoom cannot love you indeed. And I will reshare my screen.
Yeah, we only lost a minute, so you're good.
Okay, good. I'll back up a little bit in the thought that I was having here, and we'll go on from there, right? The point that I was trying to make, and do shout out if I drop again, I apologize. My internet connection has decided to be wonky, as always, at exactly the wrong moment. But the point that I was trying to make is that the choices that the university has made over the course of this last 2 years demonstrate that for the institution and for its ways of being, I mean, it is convinced that it is more important than the people for whom the institution exists. And all of those choices have led me to ask what would be required for us to remake the university as an institution that's structurally capable of living up to its duty of care for all of its members, rather than seeking in a moment of crisis to minimize its obligations and ensure that all of its relationships remain forever contingent. Now, one thing that would be required in order for that work to take place is collective action, right? Because Tressie McMillan Cottom is right. You alone cannot change things. Together we might, but first we have to build that together. We have to build the spaces and places of supporting that together. And we have to find ways to ensure that our commitment to together supersedes and outlasts the pressures we experience as individuals. So much of what follows derives from the arguments that I made in Generous Thinking. And the subtitle of the book, A Radical Approach to Saving the University, really intended to gesture toward my growing conviction that the of institutions of higher education in the United States is going to require those of us who work on campus to change our approach to the work we do within them and the ways we use that work to connect the campus to the many publics that it serves. Now, the radical approach part of the subtitle grew out of my increasing sense that the necessary change is a huge one, right? And that it can't be made incrementally, but that instead it requires, as Chris Newfield notes in the conclusion of The Great Mistake, a paradigm shift, right? Because there is no easy path or simple tool that can readily take us from where we are today to where we need to be. As Tressie McMillan Cottom again has noted of the crisis in higher education today, this is not a problem for technological innovation or a market product. This requires politics. Now, the problem, after all, begins with politics. The American university system that not too long ago served as a highly accessible engine of social mobility, making a rich liberal arts-based education broadly available, has been utterly undone. Facing today not just the drastic reduction in that institution's affordability, but an increasing threat to its public orientation, as rampant privatization not only shifts the burden of paying for higher education from the state to individual students and families, but also turns the purpose of our institutions from the creation of a shared social good, right? A broadly educated population ready to participate in building a better world, to instead focus on the production of market-oriented individual benefit. And all the while, right, we're also facing what Inside Higher Ed has described as a larger than typical decline in confidence in an American institution in a relatively short time period. Now, this falling confidence can't simply be dismissed anymore as evidence of an increasingly entrenched anti-intellectualism in American life. I mean, without doubt, that exists, right? But we have to consider the possibility that, as I argue in the last chapter of Generous Thinking, that the paradigm under which higher education has operated in the United States is failing, and it's failing fast. And if our institutions are to survive, we must find a new way of articulating and living out the value of the university in the contemporary world. And this is true not least because this shift in public opinion didn't just happen by itself, right? It was made to happen as part of a program of discrediting and privatizing public services across the nation. However, from time to time, we are confronted with undeniable evidence that many of our institutions, and even those institutions that most profess their commitment to public service, have utterly betrayed the trust that the public has placed in them. Which is to say that the decline in confidence in the university is not just caused by the public failing to understand the importance of what we do. It's also that we have in many ways failed, right? We've failed to make that importance clear. We've failed to protect our communities, both on campus and off. We've failed to build institutions that are genuinely structurally capable of living out the values that they profess. Now, what I'm asking for is a tall order, in many ways swimming against the current of the neoliberal institution. But a large part of what I'm hoping for is for us to press collectively for new ways of understanding our institutions as communities, as well as in interaction with communities, asking us to take a closer look at the ways that we communicate, both with one another and with a range of broader publics about and around our work. And some focused thinking about that mode of public engagement is in order, I would suggest, because our institutions are facing a panoply of crises that we cannot resolve on our own, right? We need the public's help as much as or more than they need ours. Now, these crises that I'm talking about don't always give the impression of approaching the kind or degree of the highly volatile political, economic, and environmental situation we're currently living through. And yet the decline in public support for higher education has always been of a piece with these other crises, part of a series of national and international transformations in assumptions about the responsibility of governments for the public good. The very notion, in fact, that there can be such a thing as the public good. And the consequences of those transformations are indeed life and death in many cases. So while the concept of generosity might seem a little touchy-feely as a means of representing the key to the future of the university, I hope in the book that I've put together a case for why this is not so. Why, in fact, the particular modes of generous thinking that I'm asking us to undertake within and around our institutions of higher education really do have the potential to help us navigate the present crises. I mean, many of our fields, after all, are already focused on pressing public issues, and many of us are already working in publicly engaged ways. But we need to generalize that kind of engagement. And we need to think about the ways that it might, if permitted, transform the institutions and the ways that we all work within it, right? That is to say, the best of what the university has to offer, what matters most, right, may lie less in its power to advance knowledge in any of its particular fields than in our ability to be a model and a support for generous thinking as a way of being in and with the world. Okay, but first, who is this we I keep referring to? What is it that we do, and why does it matter? Much of what I've written really focuses on the university's permanent faculty, partially because that faculty is my community of practice, and partially because of the extent to which the work done by that faculty is the thing that we call higher education, right? Research and teaching are the primary purposes and visible outputs of our institutions. Moreover, the principles of shared governance under which we operate, at least in theory, suggests that tenured and tenure-track faculty members have a significant responsibility for shaping the future of the university. But it's important to be careful in deploying this we. As Helen Small has noted, the first person plural is a rhetorical sleight of hand, right, by which the concerns of the profession can be made to seem entirely congruent with those of the democratic polity as a whole. And so while I hope that my argument has something important to say to folks who work on university campuses but are not faculty, or who do not work on university campuses at all, that connection can't be assumed, right? It would be great if we could make it possible for the we that I'm focusing on here to refer to all of us on campus and off, who want to strengthen both our systems of higher education and our ways of engaging with one another in order to help us all build stronger communities to ensure that all of us count, right? But that, in fact, is part of the work ahead. We talk a lot, after all, about community on campus, both about community engagement and about the institution itself as a community. But we don't often talk about what it is we mean when we invoke the concept. Now, Miranda Joseph explores the ways in which community gets mythologized, romanticized, and so comes to serve what she calls a supplementary role with respect to capitalism, right? So community functions to fill its gaps and smooth over its flaws in ways that permit capitalism to continue functioning without real opposition. Additionally, community in the singular, right, the community, runs the risk of becoming a disciplinary force, right, a declaration of groupness that's designed to produce and define us that inevitably suggests and excludes them. If we were to understand community instead as multiple and diverse, right, as shifting entities that serve strategic purposes, we might be able to embrace community not as a declaration, but as an activity, right, a practice of solidarity, a process of coalition building. And this is a way of rethinking who counts, of adding others to our numbers and adding ourselves to theirs. This call for solidarity between the university and the communities outside its walls, which I raise in Generous Thinking, has been part of higher education's history for quite some time. This subject, in fact, of the student-led calls for institutional change that spanned the 1960s and 1970s. But as Roderick Ferguson has detailed, those calls were met with deep resistance, not only within the university itself, but within the governmental and corporate environment that oversaw the university, leading to many of the political shifts whose apotheosis we're living out today. In reaction, our institutions, rather than tearing down the walls as they had been called upon to do, instead turned inward. They became self-protective. They looked away from the possibility of building solidarity with the publics that the university was meant to serve. And so community in this kind of strategic sense has been the university's weakness over the last several decades, when it should have been its strength. If we're to save our institutions from the relentless economic and political forces that today threaten to undo them, we must begin to understand our campus as a site where new kinds of communities and new kinds of solidarities can and must be built. So the book overall makes the argument that rebuilding a relationship of trust between the university and the public that it ostensibly serves requires regrounding the institution in a mode of what I refer to as generous thinking, focusing its research and pedagogical practices around building community and solidarity both on campus and across the campus borders. It requires concerted efforts to make clear that the real good of higher education is and must be understood as social rather than individual. Generous thinking asks us to consider how we work with one another on campus and how we connect our campuses to the publics around us. It begins by understanding generosity as a mode of engagement grounded in listening to one another and to the publics with whom we work, attempting to understand their concerns as deeply as possible before we leap forward to our critiques and solutions. The book goes on to explore ways that the critical reading practices that we engage in on campus might be opened up to foster greater connection between scholars and other readers, creating means for those readers to see more of the ways that scholars work, as well as the reasons for those methods, and for scholars at the same time to learn more about why general interest readers read the way they do, building key bridges between two communities that too often seem to speak past one another. I also spend time thinking about ways and reasons that scholars might do more of their work in public, publishing in more openly accessible venues and in publicly accessible registers, and developing more community-engaged research in order to bring the university's resources to bear in helping work through community concerns, as well as to transform those communities from passive recipients of the university's knowledge into active collaborators in shared projects. But if we're going to make the kinds of change that I argue for in the ways that scholars work, both on campus and off, the university as an institution must undergo a fairly radical transformation, becoming the kind of institution that supports rather than dismisses or in fact actively punishes collaboration and community engagement. The university must become the kind of institution that can focus less on individual achievement and on educating for individual leadership, and that instead focuses on building community and indeed on educating for community building. And this really requires a radical rethinking of the reward structures of higher education, right? What we value and how we demonstrate that we value it. Our universities are in many ways structured as collectives, right, in which each member of the institution is charged with some part of the well-being of the whole. And this is how we derive our principles of shared governance, right, that we each have a contribution to make to the operation of the institution. And yet, when we examine both the kinds of work for which we are actively rewarded on campus, as well as the nature of the rewards themselves, we repeatedly find an emphasis on the individual rather than the whole. For instance, for faculty at an institution like mine, the work for which we are most rewarded is our research, the thing that we pointedly refer to as our own work. And the rewards we receive often pull us away from the collective. So if I were to publish a well-received book or an article in a prestigious journal, I might be eligible for a course release or for relief from service responsibilities, right? And all of the other possible rewards that I can seek, promotions, raises, sabbaticals, and so forth, all of them encourage me to retreat from my membership in the university community and instead to focus on my own work, right? And this is part and parcel of the hyper-individualistic orientation of the contemporary university, in which every form of merit, including grades, honors, credits, degrees, rank, status, and more, every bit is determined by what I individually have done, even when I've done it collaboratively. So add to that the situation of most institutions of higher education today, in which austerity-based thinking leads us to understand that merit is always limited. And thus your success, your distinction, your accomplishments can only come at my expense, right? The result is that
I think we've lost you again, Kathleen. I'm looking to see if she got dropped out again.
I'm back.
There she is.
How long ago did I drop?
Like 30 seconds, practically nothing.
Okay.
Okay.
So sorry about this. I do not know what's going on. We've got gigabit fiber coming into this house and it's just not behaving today. So
it is really no problem. We barely lost anything.
Okay, good.
As Cheryl says in the chat, it's totally okay.
Awesome. Thank you. So add to that the situation of most institutions of higher education today, in which austerity-based thinking leads us to understand that merit is always limited, right? And that your success, your distinction, your accomplishments can only come at my expense. And the result of that is that we find ourselves in a zero-sum game in which we have to compete with one another for attention, for acclaim, for resources, for time. We're trapped on a quest for what Thorstein Veblen described as invidious distinction, in which we separate ourselves from others by climbing over one another. Now, it's important to note that this situation applies as much to institutions as to the individuals who work within them. Budget models such as responsibility center management, I have a hard time even saying it, promote competition amongst academic units for majors and enrollments, and they actively discourage any attempts to think across units, whether one would do so in order to develop new interdisciplinary collaborations or to support connections and resource sharing across the larger university structure. And insofar as these sorts of budgetary structures within our institutions drive us all toward competition, our institutions as a whole are similarly under a mandate, as Chris Newfield has said, to compete all the time, right? Seeking to distinguish themselves from other institutions by promoting their own interests. Now, we really need our institutions to distance themselves from the rankings and the other quantified metrics for excellence that pit them against one another in order for those institutions to promote more generous, more collaborative internal structures, as well as a work environment in which each of us who work for them can move fully away from competitive thinking ourselves and into a mode that's more collective. And this is no easy task. Over the course of the last several years, both while generous thinking was first coming out and since it's been published, I've had the opportunity to speak on a number of college and university campuses, both in person and via Zoom, where faculty and staff and students and administrators alike have been thinking about how they might create and support a greater sense of connection between their campuses and their communities and their general public-facing mission. Now, the folks who invited me to give these talks range from the officers of campus AAUP chapters to university presidents and their advisors, And all of them felt a connection with the arguments that I was making, not least because they recognized that their institutions required not just better strategic plans, but really deep culture change. But that culture change requires, among other things, a serious rethinking of how we work, why we work the way we do, how we assess and reward that work, and how we recognize as work things that tend to get dismissed as service, for instance, but that play a crucial role in building and sustaining collaborative communities. But generous thinking focused pretty tightly on the why, right? And the what of the changes that our university cultures need to make. And it spent a whole lot less time on how. I mean, for instance, it's clear that making a better, more sustainable institution requires us to move away from individualistic ideas of meritorious production. In fact, to step off the Fordist production line that forever asks us to do more, and instead to think in a really humane fashion about ways that we can instead do better. Right? Better often, in fact, requires slowing down. It requires talking with our colleagues and our communities, and most importantly, listening to what others have to say. Right? Better requires engagement. It requires connection, sharing, time, in ways that more nearly always encourages us to rush past. Turning from more to better can really help us access the pleasures, indeed the joys of our work that life on the production line has required us to push aside. But given the ways that we've all been steeped in more, it's not at all clear how we might begin to slow down, to make a set of changes that go against the ingrained ways of working that have come to seem natural to us. So I was already thinking that I needed to follow generous thinking up with something that would dig a bit further into the how of transformation. And then after one of the talks that I gave, an attendee asked me a question that made the stakes of thinking about how painfully clear. Her question has been stuck in my head for the last 2+ years. Generosity is all well and good, she said.
Do you guys want me to? Oh, we're losing you again.
Okay.
Nope, you're back. You're back.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm just going to start from the question that I was asked again, which was, she asked me, generosity is all well and good, right? And something that it's relatively easy to embrace when resources are plentiful, but how do we practice generosity in hard times? Can we afford to think generously when we're facing significant budget cuts, for instance? Or is it inevitable that we fall back into analytics-driven competition with every unit, much less every worker, out to protect their own resources and privileges? Now, I don't remember how I answered that question when I was asked it. I suspect that it was some combination of saying, you're completely right, that's the real question, and like pointing out the difficulties involved in being generous in hard times, and that those difficulties are precisely why we need to practice generosity in a determined way in good times. And I may have said some things about the importance of transparency and priority setting and decision making and of involving the collective in that process. But I do know that as I stood there saying whatever it was that I said, I was thinking, wow, this is hard. I really just don't know, right? I don't know how we find the wherewithal to remain generous when times are bad, except by having practiced generosity enough to have developed some individual and institutional muscle memory, and by recommitting ourselves to our basic values again and again. I especially don't know how we remain generous at a moment when our institutions are approaching us, right, the ones who work for them, as well as the ones who rely on them, invoking the notion of a shared sacrifice required to keep the institution running. I don't know because I do want the institution to survive and I want to sustain the community that it enables, but I also know that the sacrifices that are called for are never genuinely equitably distributed. And I also know that however much I may want to keep the institution running, the institution is not thinking the same thing about me, right? Our institutions cannot love us back. However much we sacrifice for them, They will never sacrifice for us. And this returns me to Tressie McMillan Cottom's point, right? You alone cannot make the institution more humane, and especially not by killing yourself in the process. This is especially true for members of minoritized groups working in the academy. It's especially true for faculty without tenure. It's especially true for staff. It's especially true for everyone whose positions in the hierarchies of prestige and comfort leave them vulnerable, especially at moments when "we're all in it together" is invoked, not in the context of resource sharing, but of sacrifice, right? Sacrifice always rolls downhill, and it accelerates in the process. And this is how we end up with furloughs and layoffs among contract faculty and staff at the same time that we find ourselves with a new associate vice president for shared sacrifice. So the only way to prevent such sacrifice from rolling downhill is to build structures to channel it otherwise. And this is the deepest goal of generous thinking, and by extension of the follow-up project that I'm now working on, which is entitled Leading Generously. In this project, I'm focusing on how we can work collectively to build a more generous environment in which we can do our work together, right? What kinds of leadership are required for us to remake the university into that institution that's capable of living up to its duty of care for all of its members in good times and in bad? Leading Generously is in some ways intended to be a practical handbook for putting some of the ideas of generous thinking into action, but in so doing, it asks its readers to reconsider some basic concepts that underwrite big structural change. It proposes that despite the enormity of the transformation that higher education needs today, local changes can begin to make a difference, and that we are capable of making those local changes, which can network out into something larger. Among the concepts that demand reconsideration, however, is the very notion of leadership itself. Right? We conventionally associate leadership with the folks at the top of an institutional hierarchy, like the ones with the authority to steer the ship. It's not for nothing that leadership has become a kind of euphemism for administration. Now, while I hope that Leading Generously might speak to those leaders, right, those positional leaders, the project really is attempting to address everyone on campus, beginning with the argument that everyone in an institution has the potential to be a leader, to create transformative change that can model ways of being that others might learn from and join in with. Now, my conviction about that nature of leadership places a lot of emphasis on individual actors in ways that might seem a bit odd or a bit at odds with some of the most important ideas circulating today about how power operates. These critical ideas, including arguments about race and racism, arguments about sex, gender, and misogyny, arguments about class and power, all of these critical ideas understand the issues that they explore to be systemic rather than individual, which is to say they argue that real change requires social transformation, right? It requires building institutions, creating governments, enacting laws, transforming economies, all in ways that work toward equity rather than supporting privilege. And I'm completely convinced by those arguments, and I have that same end goal, right? Building institutions that are capable of supporting and facilitating the work of creating better communities and a better world. But the institutions that we have today aren't going to transform themselves. The key to this problem is where we locate agency, right? Who has the power to start the process of making significant change in the world? If we understand power is residing in the structures and the systems that govern our lives, there's little agency left to the individual. And it's unquestionably true that the structural problems that we face are enormous and that one individual can't do much to reshape the world. But groups of individuals can. And building those groups starts with individuals who decide to do more, right? Who decide to put what individual agency they do have to work in solidarity with others. And so leading generously begins with you, right? Where you are. It starts from the position that each of us is equipped to make change in the aspects of our institutions over which we have influence, and that these changes can model new modes of being within our communities. But there's a second part to the question of agency, how to multiply it. One of the deepest flaws in contemporary models of leadership is the assumption that our reach becomes bigger as we climb the org chart, right? And of course, power does grow in that direction. But what also happens is that you narrow your connections until you find yourself at the pinnacle of the institution, right? You're at the center of power, but you're teetering there alone. And so Sarah Buss notes in the introduction to a recent collection of essays entitled Radical Humility, that it's through connections that we become larger, not through ego. And building those connections requires a willingness to step out of the singular position of power and to work on coalition building instead. Right? We need those coalitions to transform a complex organization, and we need to act in solidarity for those coalitions to succeed. Because of this requirement, it's important to recognize that the object of leadership is not institutions, but people, right? Bringing them together and organizing for change. Building a more generous, deeper sense of us asks us to focus our attention on our relationships with our colleagues and with our broader communities, ensuring that we maintain the humanity, not just of those we work with and for, but of the structures through which all of us connect. So how to begin transforming your institutions then is shoring up the means of moving from you to us, right? The means of building those collections or collectives and coalitions that are required to transform our institutions and make them capable of the kinds of community-oriented thinking we most need today. And there are aspects of this transformation that require high-level administrative intervention, right? Developing the post-RCM budget model that rewards collaboration and contributions to the collective success of the institution, rather than inducing increased competition among units. And quite honestly, I believe that any institution that could successfully develop and implement such a model would become a shining example for others to learn from. But beyond these high-level administrative aspects of transformation, there are more local aspects as well, aspects that each of your units can take on. Many of our units are governed by bylaws or other policy documents, and the thing about those documents is that they can be revised. Right? It's often a messy process, but bringing together the members of a department, for instance, to articulate their values and then rewrite their bylaws to align with those values can foster deep cultural change by looking hard at the discrepancy between, for instance, our desire for transparency and equity and our policies limiting who gets to participate in and vote on departmental processes. Or by looking hard at the conflict between our desire for innovation and impact in scholarly work and our policies defining what counts as research in highly limited ways. Now, none of this is easy, right? Not least because it requires us to do some deep self-examination, questioning both the ways our policies have become established and our attachments to them. As an expert in organizational change has put it, people don't resist change. They resist being changed. We need to think hard about what the kinds of cultural change we'd like to see in our institutions will ask of us. We need to consider how we might become better listeners, how we might learn to sit with difficult conversations and even criticism, how we might commit to assessing our work and the work of those around us based on our deepest values, how we might cultivate an atmosphere of mutual and renewable trust, and so on. So each of these ideas, listening, vulnerability, values, trust, support, and more, each of them is deceptively simple, but with careful consideration can become the foundation for a practice of community building, for thinking through institutional policies and processes and ensuring that they serve the people for whom the institution operates. The necessity of that practice is clear. right? Our institutions cannot survive the crises that they've been facing over the last 2 years and that they continue facing today unless the people and the relationships that make up the institution thrive. Budgets and bottom lines matter, but without its people, the students, the staff, the faculty, the community, the university is nothing. And that's the thing that we need to understand now more than ever. And the thing that I am delighted to hear that all of you have been working toward in this institute over time, right? The recognition that the primary work of the university is connection. And that in hard times, the most generous thing we can do is to connect with ourselves and with everyone we work with so that we all might develop the collective strength that's necessary to return and rebuild. Thank you very much. And thank you for bearing with my stupid internet connection. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to see if having stopped sharing, the internet will allow me to be visible.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And really the blips were, I really don't think we missed more than a couple seconds. How you went out and came back in so quickly, I'm very impressed. So.
I would be impressed if it weren't, anyway, here we are. So
I am going to invite everybody to use, Liz just had a really funny comment in the chat that she said it's a nice ironic quote from the person who wrote Generous Thinking to say, I'm going to stop sharing now.
Enough sharing already. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask folks to go ahead and start filling up the Q&A with both, clarifying questions or also just, big picture ruminations, whatever you feel like putting in there. And I have 2 questions to kick us off because I know it'll take some time for people to put that in. The first one is I think a really just large thought exercise. If you, and some of us in this chat know what I mean by this, because we fantasize all the time, like when I have my university, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you, even just looking at your own university, very different from ours, more of an R1, larger scale, but lots of similarities. And you could sort of say, okay, here's one really large structural thing that I just wish I could get to change right now. What would that fantasy wish be? Like, what do you hope for in terms of a structure that looks different?
I have so many. Where even to begin? Okay, I'm going to start with the thing that in every single conversation I have had in the last 10 years about transformations in the scholarly communication landscape, the iceberg I think that's going to be a decent metaphor, the iceberg on which those conversations have always run aground, sort of, it's a little mixed, is tenure and promotion. Right. It's invariably that like, oh, but, we can't change X because this is how faculty do tenure and promotion. And so we're beholden to it. I would really like to radically transform that process in 2 different ways. One of which is to recognize that the purpose of the tenure and promotion review 6 years into a scholarly career is not to sort of look back at those 6 years and assess them and say, you have done enough, here is your reward. But instead to look forward and to say, we want to keep you on this faculty with us for the rest of your career. And so we're going to make it possible for you to stay. And so if we understood that moment, not as being summative, right? Like you have to sprint as hard as you can until you get to the finish line and then you get the reward. And then what happens? Most associate professors collapse from exhaustion. Cannot continue pressing forward in the same way. And in fact, often have in the previous 6 years put off doing the work that matters most to them because it seems risky. So they're going to do the safe work up until they get tenure, and then theoretically are going to pick up the stuff that really matters. But it can become hard to pick that up again, once it's been sitting so long. What I would really love is, again, for us to sort of develop a process, and it's one that I've been privileged to work a bit within here at Michigan State, because I have a visionary dean under whom I work, to have a process that asks faculty every year to produce a statement of their long-term goals, right? What does success look like for you? Where do you want to see your career go? Then what are the major milestones that are going to get you to that kind of success? And what are the stepping stones that lead you up to the bigger milestones? And through that process, create what looks pretty much like an individualized learning plan, right? Here is the way that I am going to define my career as it moves forward. And that process is what gets evaluated in a formative way at the key moments of review. Not did you do enough, but instead, like, how's it going? We really like the work you're doing and we want you to keep doing it. Or what are the things that we need to do to help you do the work more and better, right? And that is the thing that I would really love to see change. Second change for tenure and promotion, all of the benefits and privileges that come with it should not be exclusive. Right? They should not be the thing that only this small sector of our campuses receive. That kind of job security, that kind of respect, that kind of intellectual freedom should be something that everyone on campus has. So if I could, like, those are my first two acts when I become goddess of the universe.
That's a universe I'd be happy to live in. I will follow up on that with one other question, and then I will try to make sense of all the things happening in these two things here. But the next question I'll have was something that came up in the chat earlier, particularly about staff, especially as you're talking about promotion and tenure. And, precarity is something we talk a lot about with contingent faculty, adjuncts, but staff, have so many interesting connections into the stuff you're talking about, right? Not afforded the protections and job securities of tenure, often underpaid or fairly contingent. And also, interestingly, like I remember somebody saying to me, oh, this is not just a university. Well, first of all, they say it's a business, but then they also say it's a hospital and it's a bank, and it's, because staff are actually sometimes working jobs that have much deeper connections to jobs that are non-academic.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the role that you see for staff in this paradigm shift and
Absolutely.
why that matters?
I think it's a crucial role. I think it's a crucial role in a couple of different regards. It is entirely possible for, someone who is working in the bursar's office to feel as though they're doing the same job that they would be doing in a bank, right? That it does feel much more akin to industry, akin to those professional positions than it does to higher education. And yet, the purpose of all of that work that's being done within the bursar's office, for instance, do we still have bursar's offices, by the way? Okay, we do. Good. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't being totally anachronistic in this. The work that gets done in those offices is still about serving the community of folks who are being educated through this institution. Right. So my colleague, Bill Hart-Davidson, who's Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies within the College of Arts and Letters here at MSU, is very fond of saying that, in fact, everyone on campus has or should have the same mission, right? That all of us, from the groundskeepers to the president of the institution, are really about a kind of public service in a quest for the development of knowledge and its dissemination. And thinking about the work of staff from that position, I think really can help us sort of break down some of the barriers between staff and faculty in understanding what it is we're there for. It can also begin to undo some of the hierarchy that's there. So within the College of Arts and Letters, the review process that I described has been used for the last several years, not just for faculty reviews, but for staff reviews as well, and have asked staff to really set their professional goals for what it is they're doing and why they're doing it, have asked them to do so in a values-based way that embraces the same values that the entire college has selected and discussed and debated and embraced. And that has really attempted to understand in a deep way that we're all attempting to do the same good. Now, there are some radical differences that remain, and these are the things that I think we need to hammer on pretty hard, particularly as you climb the ladder of faculty ranks. One of the key things that comes with those ranks is the ability to say no. And staff, least of anybody on campus, they just do not have the ability to say no, right? So anything that a faculty member doesn't want to do either is going to roll down to a more junior faculty member or a contingent faculty member, or is going to land on a staff person's desk. And I think that part of what we need to do in order to think about how staff become part of our communities in a deep way is to really get faculty to reconsider the ways that they work with staff and their assumptions about the hierarchy between faculty and staff that go underexplored.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A now. First is a question from Liz All, who is a professor who teaches poetry and creative writing, and she asks, are there any solid examples or stories of the quote unquote stuff we need to do having been done or partly done, just a little bit out there anywhere?
So sadly, again, I'm going to turn to my own college because my dean, Chris Long, is someone to look up. It's Christopher P. Long. He goes by CP Long all over the place. He is what brought me to Michigan State, getting the opportunity to work with him on institutional transformation. He has put in place this kind of process of rethinking how tenure and promotion works. He has taken budget decisions that the dean is required to make, and he has brought okay, you froze. And so now I'm thinking I'm frozen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can. Okay. So Chris has brought the chairs and directors from the entire college together in helping him make budgetary decisions, in exposing to them the limitations of what he's able to do. And in asking, like, for instance, as every chair and director puts in their request for new faculty lines every year, has brought all of those requests to the committee of the whole and asked everyone to review them and discuss them in a way that, you know, ultimately he has to make the decision and it doesn't make everybody happy, but we've gotten to see the discussion and the criteria under which the decision gets made in ways that most institutions don't have. So, you know, I would just point to those two things, and that he's really, really working now on attempting to take that model and see if it can be brought upward in the administration. He's working very closely with the provost and is really trying to see if some of his colleagues, his fellow deans across the campus, might be interested in learning from it. We'll see how that goes.
I'm going to turn now to Abby Good's question. I don't know if you can see that in the Q&A because there's quite a bit to it. And just instead of reading the whole thing, she's really talking about collegiality, I think, and how we define that in a generous university. You know, to what extent do we really listen to our colleagues? To what extent does an assumed consensus or homogeneity among faculty and staff preclude generous collaborative work? What would it look like to ask our colleagues what they think? And so her final question is, what advice do you have for modeling and working more generously at the collegial level?
that is a really, really awesome question. And it surfaces for me a really important thought, which is that, I mean, obviously the origins of, like, collegial and colleague have the same etymological origin, right? They're very, very tied. And yet collegiality frequently gets used as a weapon, a kind of cudgel against those who disagree, against those who are different, against those who don't somehow fit with the main thread of the culture. And for that reason, you know, a lot of bad promotion and tenure review processes end up hinging on questions of collegiality, right? And that they're used in order to keep people who don't fit, who are seen as being disruptive or what have you, from being fully part of the organization, which is a distinctly uncollegial thing to do, and yet that's what happens. So we have moved very heavily against or away from the idea of using collegiality in that way, and yet really want to build better colleagueship. And one of the things that I think we need to work for in that respect is to think about our tolerance for disagreement, right? Ways that we can disagree productively, ways that we can hold a question open and recognize that not everyone is on the same page, and that it's okay for not everyone to be on the same page, to really attempt to listen, to find out why someone disagrees with us and what we might learn from that disagreement. And to really be willing to sort of live with a kind of dissensus, right? To recognize that rather than sort of smoothing out all of the wrinkles and getting to full consensus, that we might in fact need to recognize that there is not going to be full agreement. And so, like, I think the key skill that question raises for me is really thinking about how we can disagree with one another in ways that don't lead to the breakdown of relationships, but in fact in ways that build up stronger relationships.
All right, two more and we'll see where we are. You've been going and going, so thank you so much. But we are really so happy to have you.
Oh, thank you.
If you can crack this nut, Kathleen, seriously, I'm going to be really impressed. Elliot Gruner, who is our Director of English Composition at Plymouth State, asks, how do we break the cycle of contingency, particularly for employment, which seems at the heart of the structural problem?
It is absolutely at the heart of the structural problem. And I was just writing about this a little bit. And so I'm going to try an idea out on y'all. And I really want feedback on this because it's, okay. Part of the problem of contingency has come about because of what is described as the university's need to be able to be flexible, right? We don't want to hire a full-time person teaching a full load in field X because sometimes we need those classes and sometimes we don't, and we need to be able to have someone on hand to teach them. So we'll just hire somebody to teach a couple of classes here and there. And so we end up with more and more contingent faculty rather than positions that are seen as being permanent and that are given all of the benefits of permanence. In part, some of that need for filling gaps within our curricula that lead to the hiring of more contingent faculty come from, again, coming back to our senior colleagues, which I should say us senior colleagues, because I am one of them, who have the capacity to say no, right? Who have no real reason not to say no, because there are no sanctions that come with that, who are rewarded by getting to take time away from teaching And, if their research is going well, you get more time for research, and therefore you're not going to teach that one class because you've gotten a course release for it. Now we need somebody to fill that one class. We will hire a contingent person to fill that class. So I think we really need to take a hard look. We, the senior faculty, need to take a hard look at ourselves and at the ways that our decisions and the rewards that we receive for doing our work have created the contingency problem. And in large part, we bear some responsibility for this. But we also need to look at the university and its ideas about what it considers to be flexible and why it's leaning toward flexibility as a hiring model. What I would love to see, and my fear is that the university has begun to adopt the sort of Silicon Valley derived mode of agility, right? Understanding that you need to be able to turn on a dime. You need to be able to shift your business model. You don't know if you want to offer that major anymore. You don't know if Shakespeare is still worth teaching. So you want to be able to, I see Liz is saying gig work. That's it, right? Like it's the university as gig economy, which is increasingly the driving force for contingent hiring. I really want to find a way to get the university to recognize that agility is not in its interest, that what is in its interest is nimbleness, which is a different thing. I understand agility on the one hand to be all about moving, right? It's just like you're a sailboat and the wind blows and you blow with the wind. Nimbleness, on the other hand, when you look at the definitions in the OED of the two, agility is just like ability to move rapidly and gracefully. I don't know anything about gracefully in any of this, but whatever. Nimbleness is described as not just having those characteristics of graceful movement, but also of intelligence and intelligence brought to bear on the movement itself, right? And so if we were able as an institution to think more nimbly instead of agilely, if we were able to create full positions that are well compensated and that have full benefits and that are able to flex within that position as needed, right? People who can pick up a wider range of classes than your average English literature PhD can pick up, for instance, or people who are able to do both teaching work and administrative work and change the balance between the two as needs shift on campus, that we might be able to create good jobs that are valued on campus, that keep us from having to go down the increasing route of more and more and more contingent labor. That would be how I would like to see this solved. Again, like, how do we do that? I need to find an institution that's willing to like experiment with this and that's willing to look at its staffing processes and really rethink them from the ground up. So if anybody knows of an institution like that, let me know.
This might be potentially a dovetail to Jonathan's question. And for those of you who don't know, Jonathan Porras from the Open Ed community, he's now working with the New England Board of Higher Education on some of their OER initiatives. So I've had the great pleasure of sitting in some meetings with him. And he asks about the Open Ed community, which he is positing might be slightly less fucked than other communities. Sorry, Mom, because my mom is on this webinar and I just said the F word. So he's asking, do you have any experience with Open Ed? How do you think it fits in with some of what you're talking about, if you do?
Jonathan, I do want to agree with you. It is an extraordinarily generous community. And I think in large part, I'm going to give it a second because Robin has frozen, which I think means I have frozen.
You're still talking perfectly.
Okay.
Looking good. Yep.
Okay, I'm back. Great. Anyway, It's an extremely generous community. And one of the forms of Open Ed's generosity that I really, really love is its drive toward getting the institution to look at the tools that it's using in the process of doing its work, right? So rather than, you know, okay, I'm going to go there. Rather than relying on corporate derived solutions for things that need to be done on a campus by campus basis. Instead, thinking about how we can work across campuses to create university owned platforms on which we can do the same work, right? So every university campus everywhere needs some kind of software system that can handle course scheduling. And every university needs a student information system, and every campus needs a library catalog, and every campus needs, I argue, an institutional repository. Every campus needs a learning management system, right? Everybody needs one. What if instead of using corporate derived systems that we all hate because they don't actually work the way we want them to, if we were collectively to come together and build a community-owned set of platforms that serve our purposes for our reasons, and we kept the intellectual property in-house, and we didn't then have to pay millions of dollars every year into corporate hands for that software, right? This is one of the things that I love the Open Ed community for, because they're really looking at that infrastructural level of change and thinking about what can we do with open tools? Yes, I mean, Apereo is exactly one of those platforms. Like, I like to think my own Humanities Commons is one of those platforms.
And actually, I think there's there's definitely some Open Ed heroes in the audience here, but there's also some folks probably newer to these ideas. Could you just tell us a little bit about Humanities Commons? Because I think it's so linked to the philosophy of generous thinking.
Awesome, absolutely. So Humanities Commons is a scholarly network that we originally built when I was working at the Modern Language Association. We opened MLA Commons. It's a social network that's built on WordPress with a bunch of plugins, including BuddyPress, and we've got a repository that's connected to it. We launched MLA Commons as a platform for MLA members to be able to communicate with one another and to form groups and have discussions and share work and collaborate and communicate and all of that kind of good thing. And as soon as we launched it, we started having members coming to us saying, well, this is all well and good, but I collaborate with people who are in art history and they're never going to join the MLA. So how do I get them involved in this? So we expanded and launched what is now Humanities Commons. All of the same functionality that MLA Commons had. MLA still has its space within MLA Commons, but we now have this larger entity around it that is completely free and open. Anyone who considers themselves in the humanities, we don't police this. We have a lot of scientists and a lot of, social scientists who are also in the network, but anybody who is willing to embrace the thing that's called the humanities is welcome to create an account. There are no credential checks, right? So you like, it's scholars and it's practitioners of a very wide variety. It's people who are just interested in the humanities, who want to see what's going on within our fields. And the Humanities Commons is now here at MSU. It has followed me from the MLA here. I have a research and development unit that's working on it in an ongoing way and is going to continue expanding.
You're a little frozen, but you're okay. Just give it a second. I think you'll be back. There, you're back, I think.
Okay, good. Anyway, we're continuing to expand. The wintry mix, indeed. It's April 1st. This is just not right. And it has been grapple all day today. It's been really, anyway, whatever. Humanities Commons is an open academy-owned network that functions on principles that are designed to allow the community to see not only one another and how they're communicating with each other, but also to have a real stake in governance of the platform, right? To make sure that we remain open and true to the values that we all espouse. So yeah, Humanities Commons. I would be very happy to, talk to anybody who wants more information about it or to walk anybody through it.
And I'll say to our USNH folks who are here that some years back modeled on the CUNY Commons, which is, one of the more sort of famous, mostly open platforms for people to collaborate. We built a USNH Commons that we used in beta for about a year. There were about 100 people using it, but it's very challenging, to go to your structural stuff there, Kathleen. When IT, of course, manages our technology environments, and especially over the last decade, as cybersecurity concerns have started proliferating, it's very hard, to work outside the box. I mean, we know this in particularly in teaching, because most of us are in learning management systems that are very locked down and proprietary to your content in your institution. But I think the technology environments that we choose to use, that we pay for, that we build, right, all of these are part of that structure that you're talking about. So I think I think about everything from like, what does a classroom space want to look like for this work? Yeah. What does a technology environment look like? How do you set up your HR department? Like all of those are structural things that are so interesting.
Indeed.
I'm putting into the chat for the USNH folks the little mini commons that we have going now, particularly around open resources, but it still also has those abilities to collaborate and talk to each other. So I don't see more questions in the Q&A, and just lots of awesome stuff in the chat. So I'm not sure if I missed anything. Is there anybody who wants to throw a last question in before we close out this absolutely, like, just such a great way to start my weekend, by the way. I'm going to give it just a minute for the chat or the Q&A, and then I will do a more formal closing. And I'm so glad for all the folks who were able to join us today. Oh, the thank yous are already coming. So,
nice.
I think I'm not going to be able to recover from the closing tone that I just put out in my voice. So I want to say a couple of things in closure. First of all, I want to thank you for doing something that I think is really difficult, which is trying to be sort of conceptual and aspirational and hopeful, as well as practical and realistic about the fact that we all have to go to work every day in pretty challenging environments. And you just do such a great job with that. So thank you for that work and for putting that out in the world. And then I want to say a special thanks to my colleagues in the cluster pedagogy learning community, which I really think, thanks especially to Kathy, and also to Martha and Hannah for all you did, but really especially to the people who participated over the years that we had that model going, because I've really changed the way I think about leadership and learning through working with everybody in that group. So I'm very grateful, and I think this was a wonderful closure. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to end the webinar, which probably means you all just go off into the ether. So I just want to say thank you. And Kathleen, please stay in touch, and we look forward to your next book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for putting up with my stupid internet problems.
I think it only made everything more casual, warm, and fun. So thanks to everybody, and have a great night and a great weekend, or great morning, whatever time zone you're in right now. So thanks again, and we'll see you all later.